I'm going to teach you how to not spin an F1 at 24. I'm going to show you 3 easy to understand setup techniques and a driving style technique as well to maximize your potential and minimize the chance of spinning, specifically in the medium and high speed corners. This has become quite a big issue with F1 24, and today I'm going to show you some setup knowledge and driving style knowledge that can hopefully maximize your potential on the track and allow you to enjoy the game without the fear of these silly spins what are happening and leading to uncontrollable situations with the car. So the first area I'm going to be talking about is going to be on the setup with the rear suspension stiffness, the rear ride height in general, and also the curb usage specifically in the medium and high speed corners, and how that is affecting the ground effect of the car and the suspension travel of the car, and why it's leading to uncontrollable spins. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually going to be the rear suspension stiffness, and I'm basically going to give you a small briefing, a small technical breakdown of what's happening with the suspension, the ride height, and then we're going to hit the track straight after. So what's happening with the suspension is when you go lower and lower and lower, I'm going to quickly show you an on-track demonstration. So when you're going lower on the rear suspension stiffness, as we put the car into third-person camera so you can see it a lot easier, basically the softer you go on the suspension, the more the car will be traveling on the rear suspension travel, and you can see as we're turning left and right, the car is pitching left and right down the straight. You can see when we turn to the left, the car gets thrown to the right because of the G-forces, and effectively the softer that your suspension travel is, the more the suspension will move. And the downside to the suspension moving in a ground effect Formula 1 car is the floor can start touching the tarmac, can start touching the road, and this will lead to a stall of airflow underneath the car, leading to massive snaps of oversteer. As you see going through a high-speed corner here, as the car sort of touches the floor and loses the rear downforce and loses the airflow underneath the diffuser of the car, this leads to a very unpredictable snap of oversteer, as you can see right now. As soon as we touch the inside curbing with the really soft suspension, the rear right is overloaded, overcompromised, and it causes a stall in the airflow underneath the car. And this is why you get really unpredictable snaps of oversteer when you run too soft on the rear suspension. We're often lured into a false sense of security with the suspension of the setup, to be honest, because we're so often told that the softer that you go on the suspension, especially on the rear spring, the better the traction will be, and the stiffer that you go on the rear spring, the worse the traction will be. It's a very simple definition that we've probably all heard around racing cars and racing setups as well, especially in the Formula 1 game. And to a certain degree of technicality, that is true, that the softer that you go on the spring, the better traction you'll have, but it's a limited reward system, effectively. And if you go too soft on the spring, your car will be inability, and it will have the infunctionality to actually use the compression of the spring to generate more grip, because you'll run out of travel on the rear part of the car to be generating any downforce, and at that point you'll have an unstable, unpredictable car. As we're going down the straight here in Japan, you can see the rear suspension moving as we get higher and higher on the speed, and as we go through 130R, the car pitches to the left, and you can see quite clearly what's happening when we're running the softest suspension setup. To quickly highlight a point on the traction and what's happening with the suspension, it's all about art of delicate balance between softness and stiffness within the rear suspension spring setup. And it's all about finding the balance between stability in the high-speed corners and also traction in the low speed. In a very, very basic summary, and I'm happy to do further videos to show more detailed, elaborate descriptions on these setup options. But when you go stiffer and stiffer and stiffer, let's say up to 20 on the rear suspension stiffness, you're going to see that the rear of the car moves around less as we're weaving down the straight. So you can see it's very marginal because, of course, the camera is shaking quite a lot within this game, so it's quite hard to show the very specific differences in what's happening. But you can see the car is moving less, and it's a bit more predictable, and the rear of the floor is not touching as we're weaving down the straight while using 20 instead of 1. And the point that I'm getting to on this suspension spring setup is when you start running stiffer and stiffer and stiffer, it will allow a more consistent platform for the rear of the car to not be touching during the high-speed corners. And you're going to see we're going to go through a spoon curve here, and we're just going to be able to take it easily flat on the same line. And going into replay camera and comparing to before, we quite simply don't have the problem that the rear of the car is touching the floor anymore. So because the suspension stiffness is so much stiffer, we're able to take exactly the same racing line and not have the rear of the car touching the tarmac and touching the floor, effectively stalling the airflow underneath the car. And this is why having a stiffer rear suspension setup with an F124 can allow a more stability and more stable car in the high-speed corners. Of course, this is always a balance that you have to find, and what I always try to do is get the car softer and softer and softer to get that traction out of the low speed corners, of course, but ultimately never to be compromising the stability in the high speed areas of the track. Around a 10 on the rear suspension stiffness is about the good compromise that I would recommend in F124. So now that we've shown some details about the rear suspension stiffness, we're going to move on to the rear ride height. And the rear ride height is working a very similar functionality to the rear suspension stiffness in the definition that I'm going to explain about touching the floor and stalling the airflow underneath the diffuser of the car. So now we're going to go to the lowest possible ride height setting within F124, and you're going to see the rear of the car is already going to be basically touching the floor, even while we're not going around the corners and going through high speed corners as well. And what's going to happen here is the rear of the car is so close to the floor that when you do get suspension travel while going through the high speed corners, and it's worth me explaining the reason that you get suspension travel, let me just go through the corner and I'll go into replay mode for you to explain it. Oh, big snap of oversteer already. Is what is happening when you're driving a Formula 1 car is quite simply that you have so much tons of downforce. I can't remember specifically, but you have multi-tons of downforce being generated by the wings on the front and rear of the car, and the vortices and the underneath of the car is a massive part of it. I think 60% of the downforce is coming from the floor of the car in this modern era of Formula 1 with the ground effect. So with that being said, you're getting multiple tons of downforce and suction pulling you to the road. So with suspension stiffness, what may be sensible while you're driving at 20 miles an hour, or 60 even, is not sensible when you're driving at 180 miles an hour, because effectively you need maybe 6 times the suspension stiffness to keep the car stable with its platform while driving 180 miles an hour compared to 60 miles an hour, quite simply because of the extra downforce and load added onto the car. The way to think about downforce and the suspension in this area is while you're driving at no miles an hour and you're static, there is no downforce produced by the car. So the springs can be set effectively as soft as you like, but as soon as you start driving a Formula 1 car and you start generating some downforce in the car, like I'm saying, multiple tons of downforce, hypothetically, let's say you're driving at 150 miles an hour and you're generating 2 tons of downforce, you're effectively having 2 tons of weight on the car, pushing the car into the road with the springs. So this is how you should think about downforce, and why having the correct suspension stiffness and the correct ride height is so vital to make sure that you're not stalling the diffuser by touching the road and getting these big snaps of oversteer as a result of it. You can even see it happening a little bit in this instance right here, that when we're going through the corner, the rear suspension is now starting to compress as we get back to the power, shifting the weight balance towards the rear, and that rear left of the diffuser part, the carbon fiber, starts touching the floor and stalling the airflow underneath the car, and this is what causes that snap oversteer, what you see on the example right now. Going through the first sequence of corners, you're going to see it play out big time already, big snap of oversteer, another, and you can see going through, we're just losing the car everywhere because of the rear diffuser touching the floor and having absolute inability to keep the car on the road. And you're going to see me just going replay camera right here, and you can see it's an absolute dog of a car, because every single time we get to a point that we're putting maximum load into the rear axle of the car, the diffuser starts touching the floor and losing downforce and grip because of it, making an extremely unsafe, uncomfortable and uncompromising car to any driving style. And you can see as soon as we went over the curb, and you can see the car bottomed out over the red and white and the green part of the curve and literally became uncontrollable at this point and finished off the spin, leading us to being backwards. And this is just elaborating and showing the point that I'm making about the rear diffuser hitting the floor and causing grip loss because of it. With that being said, I'm going to quickly show you what it looks like higher. And the reason that you don't want to go too high on the rear diffuser is it's such a critical part of the speed of the car. And as I said, 60% of the downforce of a modern Formula 1 car is coming from the floor of the car and underneath the car. So the lower that you can get the rear diffuser and the front ride height as well, basically the more it will compress the car. So I'm just going to quickly stop here so I can explain it in a bit more detail for you. The way that you generate downforce in a modern Formula 1 car with the floor and the suction is basically by speeding up the airflow underneath the car, and that causes a low pressure zone of air and density underneath the car basically. And it works the opposite way around from an airplane. An airplane is looking to make lift and an F1 car is looking to make suction. So basically the more suction you can generate by getting the car as low to the ground as possible without touching, because if you touch the floor to the road while you're going any speed, in fact that airflow becomes stalled, becomes trapped and does not have a direction that it can go. While airflow underneath the car has a direction, it will generate suction and will generate grip. By doing this is your fastest way around the track, by getting the car as low as possible to generate as much speed or airflow underneath the car, as much compression, and that compression will generate grip for you to be driving the corner as fast as possible. So the higher that you go on the ride height, the safer and more predictable the car will be, but the slower that the car will be if you go too high on the ride height. As you can see, we're going through this first series of corners right now, and because the rear ride height is super high, super safe, we're just able to drive any racing line we want with no risk of having any instability in the car, quite simply because the rear will never be touching the floor or never be close to it as well. So yeah, the car is super safe, super predictable in this situation, and there's no risk for me to be driving as well. So going back into the garage, this is just basically now to show maybe a good setting. What I like, what seems to be quite popular on time trial as well, is to basically be running around 50, 55, 60 seems to be a really safe balance for me. And then once you start pushing down towards 52, 53 is possibly the fastest ride height compromise generally, but around 55 is a safe baseline for you to go, and this is also about 23 front ride height is a good baseline for you to go as well. This is also why you can be getting unpredictable understeer in the high-speed corners. If your front ride height is too low, it will be clipping the floor and causing a stall of airflow and downforce as well, but we can talk about that on a different video. The final thing I'm going to be talking about is going to be the curb usage in the high-speed corners. So now that we talked about the stiffness of the suspension, the ride height of the car as well, I'm going to be now talking to you about the curbing and how it can be affecting you. So already we're going to show the example in the final corner because it's low speed. We're able to jump over the curbing very easily, very subtly right here, because we're going at a low speed and the aerodynamics of the car is not really working at this speed, whereas the mechanical balance of the car is really important, what means you can take the curbing because the aerodynamics is massively affected by the curb, whereas the mechanical balance is not massively affected by the curb. And the way to think about this is the slower that you're going, effectively the more curbing you can use, because the aerodynamic balance is going to be less and less and less affected as a natural result of that. Another advantage of using curbs in low-speed corners is simply to making the track shorter, and the shorter that the track is, the faster you can go around it. So the lower speed the corner is, remember, the downforce is going to be less affecting the car, which means you can exploit the mechanical balance and the mechanical grip of the car to be going over the curbs and generating a shorter racetrack as a result. But now I'm going to show you the polar opposite during the first sector here in Japan of what happens if you use too much curbing, and this can be unsettling the car and leading to an unpredictable racing car. So now this is sort of a medium speed corner, and you can see we start going over these curbings and it makes a bit of unpredictability in the car. Of course I'm driving not perfect because I'm not used to third person camera, but I'm driving this camera just to show you a really good demonstration of what's happening with the racing car. But when you start going over these curbings on the inside, as you can see through the first sector, what is happening right now is it's lifting the left side of the car and compressing the right side of the car, and this will be leading to the right hand side of the car possibly bottoming and clipping what I've talked about all the way through this video with the rear diffuser and the airflow underneath the car. So that is what is the risk of happening if you use too much curbing in the high speed sequences of the track, is that the compression and basically the car leaning over to one side can cause the right hand side of the floor to clip and could be stalling the airflow as well. And this is why at low speed corners the airflow is very minimal, it's not happening that much, and you can use a lot of curbing, whereas the higher speed you go, the more risk you face from the right hand side or the left hand side of the car being over compressed, stalling the airflow and leading for the inability to have consistent grip as well. So this has been a baseline and let's say a very much a beginner tutorial on how you can sort of eliminate this sort of snap oversteer with an F124. So with all that being said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more of these videos. Be sure to subscribe and I will see you next time. I've been Brendon Leigh. Thank you so much for watching and I'll catch you in the next video. Grazie ragazzi. Ciao ciao. Bye bye. Yes, we got it. Ooh.